In this video, I want to share with you some extraordinary challenges to materialism. Materialism is a philosophy which is pretty dominant in the West, and it has a certain understanding of who we are as human beings. And I think this is coming under sustained critique and challenge, and nowhere more so in the area of near-death experiences and lucidity before death and other remarkable phenomena which are now very well researched and documented, often in peer-reviewed academic journals. And I want to share some of these accounts with you because I found them mind-blowing when I first came across them. And I thought, wow, this tells us something extraordinary about who we are as a species, and also the universe that we live in as well as the transcendent spiritual realm. Now, I'm going to be drawing many of these accounts from this book, Encountering Mystery, Religious Experience in a Secular Age by Professor Dale Allison, who's a professor at Princeton in America. And I had the privilege of interviewing him recently on Blogging Theology. Do watch that video. So the first thing I want to share with you is the phenomena that he recounts in his book. Firstly, what he calls lucidity before death. Lucidity before death. What is this phenomena? Well, if you're not aware of it, it's extraordinary, and I want to share with you what he says here. And he quotes many sources and research about this. So he begins on page 103. In the middle of the 19th century, a French doctor wrote, "In certain diseases, the senses acquire an extraordinary delicacy on the approach of death, when the sick person astonishes those about him by the elevation of his thoughts, and the sudden lucidity of a mind which has been obscured during many long years." End quote. Similar are the words from a British physician of the same century, quote, "We have all observed the mind clear up in an extraordinary manner in the last hours of life, when the terminated even in the ordinary course of nature, but certainly still more remarkable when it has been cut short by disease, which had affected for a time the intellectual faculties." End quote. And Allison explains in more detail what these phenomena are. He continues, "These remarks represent once common knowledge." So this is widely known in our civilization before more recent times. Hippocrates, Cicero, Plutarch, and Galen, these are figures from the ancient world, as well as doctors in the 18th and 19th centuries, reported cases of the confused or cognitively inert becoming, shortly before death, perfectly lucid. So these people whose lives are about to end on this earth, and they may have been in advanced stages of illness and sickness, and suddenly they become very, very lucid, perfectly clear and aware and awake. William Monk, in a book published in 1887, remarked that lucidity before death, quote, "has impressed and surprised mankind from the earliest ages," unquote. Now, Allison goes on to say something very interesting. The phenomenon, however, barely shows up in the medical literature of the 20th century. So this is kind of not noticed or ignored by the doctor's profession, by the medical profession. It seems to have been largely forgotten until 2009, he says, when a German biologist, Michael Nahm, published a survey of relevant cases and coined the phrase, in English, translates as terminal lucidity. He offers this description, quote, "The re-emergence of normal or unusually enhanced medical abilities in dull, unconscious, or mentally ill patients shortly before death, including considerable elevation of mood and spiritual affectation, or the ability to speak in a previously unusual, spiritualized, and elated manner," end quote. To illustrate, Scott Haig, a well-known medical columnist and clinical professor of orthopedic surgery at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, had a patient, David, whose lung cancer, as so often happens, had metastasized to his brain. David's speech, as a result, was slurred. Then he became incoherent. Then he could no longer move. He eventually became wholly unresponsive. In other words, there was no reaction from him at all. According to Professor Haig, he showed no expression, no response to anything we did to him. As far as I could tell, he was just not there, end quote. A scan revealed that cancer had eaten most of his brain. And yet, an hour before his death, and after he had already begun to breathe irregularly, he awakened. So David actually awakened. He smiled, spoke clearly to his gathered family, and held their hands. Only then did he slip away. The attending nurse opined that it was, quote, like a miracle. This was Professor Haig's verdict. Remember, this is a medical professional. Quote, it wasn't David's brain that woke him up to say goodbye that Friday. His brain had already been destroyed. Tumor metastasizes don't simply occupy space and press on things, leaving a whole brain. The metastases actually replace tissue. Where that grey stuff grows, the brain is just not there. End quote. It's a remarkable quote from the professor there. The guy basically had little brain left. Certainly wasn't able to communicate in any way that medical science could possibly understand. And yet he became fully aware, alert, awake, and it could hold normal conversations the moment before he passed away, just an hour or so before he passed away. Remarkable, confirmed, authentic report from a medical professional. Next paragraph. Even Alzheimer's patients, reports Professor Dale Ellison, can exhibit terminal lucidity. So we all know, unfortunately, of Alzheimer's patients in a very advanced stage who are virtually unable to communicate. But these people can exhibit terminal lucidity, in other words, at approaching death. One 91-year-old woman had been wholly unresponsive for 5 years. Nothing hinted that she recognized anyone, including her own daughter, who was her caretaker. Nevertheless, a few minutes before she died, she began to engage in a coherent conversation. She spoke about death, her church, her family. Her daughter was, naturally enough, utterly baffled at her mother's momentary return to her earlier articulate self. In a similar case, a woman with Alzheimer's had not spoken with or recognized anyone for years. This is one of the most distressing things about Alzheimer's, not being able to recognize the person with Alzheimer's, not recognizing any of their family, their close family, their loved ones at all. Very distressing. Yet, a week before she died, she abruptly stirred from insentience and began conversing with her granddaughter, asking questions about the family and offering advice. Her granddaughter was taken aback by this flabbergasting flash of vitality and later remarked, "It was like talking to Rip Van Winkle." End quote. These last two accounts not only illustrate terminal lucidity, but give a sense of what is usually communicated. As Smart has noticed, of all those I interviewed, no one had a story in which angry or spiteful words were spoken during the window of lucidity. Most of the stories included final requests for favourite foods, or final reconciliations, or pronouncements of love. End quote. Another expert has related that the most common themes are memories, preparation for death, final wishes, bodily issues such as hunger, and awareness of imminent departure. Now, the chapter goes on to discuss this in further detail. Lucidity before death. I'm not going to quote all of it. You're very welcome, obviously, to read it yourselves. And I do recommend this book as an extraordinary, like encyclopedia of phenomena that are very well documented and researched today in medical journals, in many other ways, which are not really impinging on our consciousness in our materialist society. I just now want to come to a second category of extraordinary phenomena which challenges materialism. And these, of course, are the near-death experiences. These are coming quite well known now. And I just want to look at some of the accounts of these near-death experiences to give you a flavour of what they're like. Because they're not kind of vague senses of a light, as you approach death. Oh, I saw a light and it was all very heavenly and nice. No, there's some really fascinating details which corroborate, often by third parties, that what this person experienced is objectively real and reliable. It's not just a vision that people have. So Dale Allison says on page 133, the most intriguing evidence for the extra subjective nature of NDEs, in other words, the objective nature of NDEs, is this. Many people claim to have seen, while under anesthesia or otherwise unconscious, from a point of view outside their body, things that they should not have been able to see, things that were physically impossible for the patient or the person who had the NDE to have seen by any understanding of the laws of physics that we currently hold. Even if a single such claim is true, standard accounts of sense perceptions cannot, to understate the matter, be the whole picture. And this is a characteristic of Professor Allison. He tends to understate matters. I want to go much further in my conclusion and draw out what I think are the fairly reasonable conclusions that one can draw from the phenomena he discusses. And we can be much more explicit, I think, than him about what this tells us about the universe, about us as human beings, about the afterlife, about God, about the transcendent, about our souls or spirits. We can be much, I think, more confident than Dale Allison, who's trying to be perhaps more reticent, so as not perhaps to put off some people, but the evidence is very clear. Anyway, some cases are well known and appear in the literature again and again. There is the story of the man who, after a massive heart attack, was cyanotic and comatose before surgery. Immediately preceding intubation, a nurse removed his dentures and put them on a crash cart. Regaining consciousness a week later, he said to the nurse, "You know where my dentures are? Yes, you were there when they brought me into the hospital, and you took the dentures out of my mouth and put them on that cart. It had all those bottles on it, and there was a sliding drawer underneath, and you can put my teeth there, and you put my teeth there," end quote. How did he know? How could he see? There is also the story of Maria, who suffered a heart attack while in hospital. She told her social worker that during her NDE, she had seen a dark blue tennis shoe on a ledge on the 3rd floor near a window. The social worker subsequently found the shoe and reported that it could not be seen from inside the hospital. So Maria here has seen something that is physically impossible to see by the normal understandings of what is possible. And then there's the story of Pam Reynolds. In order to treat a large brain aneurysm, her doctors induced hypothermic cardiac arrest. They chilled her blood, stopped her heart, then drained the blood from her brain. During repair of the aneurysm, her EEG was flat. In other words, in a popular sense, she was dead, basically, or virtually dead. Nevertheless, upon awakening, she reported a detailed NDE, included describing the little saw used to cut open her skull and hearing things she should have been unable to hear. So in other words, she had an out-of-body experience, observed what was going on around her, and heard conversations, even though, EEG was flat. So it should have been impossible for that to happen. Professor Allison continues, it's not just that thousands of people have purported that during their NDE, they saw things they should not have been able to see. In quite a few instances, and this is a really interesting point, one count reckons the number in the literature to be over 300 cases. Third-party confirmation has been claimed. In other words, it wasn't just the person saying, oh, this happened to me, but other people, usually medical professionals, have been able to corroborate and confirm what the person having the NDE saw, witnessed, recounted, and heard, and so on. So in other words, these experiences have been verified as authentic by any normal definition of authenticity, I would suggest. This includes confirmation from medical professionals on the scene. Consider these first-hand testimonies. Now, I'm now going to mention some of these testimonies that Allison has brought together and put in his extraordinary book. And then when I've read some of these, I will offer my own personal conclusions. What conclusions can we draw from these testimonies? What do they tell us about us as human beings, about the world, the universe, about reality, about the dimensions we inhabit, about the afterlife, about God, and so on? Because this information is very rich in detail and suggests quite clearly, I think, certain conclusions that we can reasonably draw from the evidence. And I'll come to that at the end. And a couple of quotes also from the Qur'an, I think, which confirm that these experiences are certainly authentic, in principle anyway. So here's one testimony. These are the words of an ICU doctor. So there's a doctor's testimony. I operated on a woman under general anaesthetic, and when she woke up, she described her operation as if she had been on the ceiling. Not only that, she also described the operation that took place in the next theatre, the amputation of a leg. She saw the leg, she saw them put the leg in a yellow bag. She couldn't possibly have invented that, says the doctor. And she described it as soon as she woke up. I checked afterwards, and the operation had indeed taken place in the next theatre. A leg had been amputated at the very same time that she was under anaesthetic and thus totally disconnected from the world. Unquote. Wow, what does that tell you? So the person claimed to have been her spirit, her whatever you call her soul, left the body, was in a position above her body, observing what was going on to her body, and also in other rooms, in other theatres in the hospital. And what she saw and what she recounted were verified by a medical profession. As soon as she was conscious, she recounted this and said, yes, that's exactly. And the doctor said, yes, that indeed happened. Another, these are the words of a cardiothoracic surgeon. So this is a surgeon this time, corroborating, giving testimony, corroborating third-party confirmation. These are the words of a cardiothoracic surgeon. He, the patient, talked about the bright light at the end of the tunnel, as I recall, and so on. This is fairly standard in NDEs. But the thing that astounded me was that he described that operating room floating around and saying, I saw you and Dr. Canillo standing in the doorway with your arms folded, talking. I didn't know where the anesthesiologist was, but he came running back. And I saw all of these Post-it notes. These are Post-it notes you write messages on, sitting on this TV screen. And what those were any call I got, the nurse would write down and called and the phone number and stick it on the monitor. And then the next Post-it note would stick to that Post-it note. And then I'd have a string of Post-it phone calls I'd have to make. He described that. I mean, there was no way he could have described that before the operation because I didn't have any calls, right? He described the scene, things that were things that there is no way he knew. I mean, he didn't wake up in the operating room and see all this stuff, end quote. So the surgeon here is talking about the post-it notes and the phone calls and the messages and how they were left for the cardiologist. The whole procedure, there's no way that the patient could have known about this in advance because there were no calls. So clearly this is third-party confirmation of the truth of this account. Another one. These are the words of another cardiologist, quoting him here. He told me everything I had said and done, such as checking the pulse, deciding to stop resuscitation, going out of the room, coming back later, looking across at him, going over and rechecking his pulse, and then restarting the resuscitation. He got all the details right, which was impossible, because not only had he been lying in a stole, I'm not sure what that word means, and had no pulse throughout the arrest, but he wasn't even being resuscitated for about 15 minutes afterward. What he told me really freaked me out, says the cardiologist, and to this day I haven't told anyone because I just can't explain it. I just can't explain it. I don't think about it anymore, end quote. It's very sad. The cardiologist here had seen something absolutely remarkable and just hadn't told anyone, presumably because he might have been ridiculed, or might have affected his career negatively if it got out that he had said and seen these things. Who knows why? But nevertheless, a reliable medical profession corroborating what happened to this patient. These are more words of an emergency medical physician, in other words, a doctor. In theory, he, a patient who was successfully resuscitated, could have heard what we said aloud and recounted it later. But he also visually described the room and the dark-haired nurse in detail and what she did even when she was not talking. So even if the guy could hear, he shouldn't have been able to see anything. This should have been impossible, as he never spontaneously opened his eyes and had no signs of the visual brain centers working. There were approximately 60 staff members or more in the emergency department. Additionally, he described in detail what the Pacific woman did to him. I cannot imagine that random chance would have allowed him to pick her up from a previously known population and then describe in detail what she did. End quote. This is another one. These are the words of a neurosurgeon who worked on Pam Reynolds. There was absolutely no question that Pam Reynolds, I'm quoting here, was clinically dead. Her EEG was completely flat, and her evoked potential too was completely gone. I believe that Pam recalled things that were remarkably accurate. I do not understand from a physiological perspective how that could possibly have happened. He's being honest here as a doctor. He has no physical explanation as to how this could have happened. I hope not to be arrogant enough to say it can't happen. So the doctor here is being humble in the face of the unexplained. But from a scientific perspective, there is no acceptable explanation to me, he said. As a neurosurgeon, I have encountered so many things that I didn't have an explanation for. You keep it in the back of your mind, and if in your life you come up with another explanation, then you can recall it and say, this is how it works. In Pam's case, I'm far, far from that. These are the words of an orthopedic surgeon. Quote, her observations of the minutest details of her cardiac arrest were things that no one would have known. My mind raced to find a logical, scientific explanation for what she was telling me, but I could not. She had not been conscious, her eyes were closed, and she had no logical way of knowing what took place in the OR that day. Another quote, and this one's quite interesting, or even more interesting than the others, I should say. These are the words of a cardiac anesthesiologist. The patient, quote, went on to describe the number of surgeons in the operating theatre, where they were positioned, the actions of the nurses, the other events that made it clear he had been observing events from somewhere above us. Notice the positioning. So it's not like horizontally observing like the patient would do, but he was above them in his spirit, in his soul, in his, whatever you want to call it. I could hardly believe what he was saying. Over the course of my 25-year career, there have been patients who claimed to see deceased friends during their cardiac arrest, or who saw lights and the end of tunnels, or who claimed to see people made of light, perhaps angels. But I chalked that off to some kind of fantasy and refer them to the psychiatrist, he says. But what happened to this man was different. He had accurately described the operating room I was working in with great clarity. He not only showed signs of being alive when his heart and brain were inert, but also of being awake, end quote. So here was a patient whose heart and brain were inert. In other words, they weren't working, but who also showed signs of being awake above what was happening, observing, accurately recounting everything that took place during his virtual death, his near-death experience. These are the words of an inpatient medical director for a hospice centre. Quote, I continued my conversation with Ricardo, hoping there was something he would say that would prove his experience. Dr. Lerma, I need your help. When I was out of my body and floating up above the trauma room, I spotted a 1985 quarter, so American coin, lying in the right-hand corner of an 8-foot-high cardiac monitor. Could you please check for me? It would mean so much. I was curious and skeptical enough to oblige him and went to the emergency room with a ladder. I climbed up with the nurses standing by. They were also curious to know if a patient had really been able to see something while we were bringing him back to life. So the patient wasn't even fully alive at this point. To our total amazement, there it was, just as he had seen it. And even the year was right, 1985. Still, I was skeptical. I wondered if this man could have put the quarter there. So I checked some of the details and found there was no way he could have known the quarter was there. It had been years since he'd been able to climb a ladder. I could find no connection with anyone who had worked on the newly built trauma rooms. End quote. Another example. These are the words of a psychiatrist on call at an ER, recounting his response after a patient told him that he had been doing down the hall. That's what it says, doing down the hall, while she was unconscious. The person was going down the hallway whilst unconscious. Quote, the hair rose on the back of my neck and I felt goosebumps. This is like the psychiatrist saying this. There was no way Holly could have known that I had spoken with Susan, let alone been familiar with the content of our conversation or the stain on my tie. And yet she did. Every time I tried to focus on what she said, I found my thoughts getting muddled. Psychiatrist saying this. I couldn't deny that she knew the details of my conversation with her roommate. I'd heard it with my own ears. It definitely happened. But I couldn't figure out how she knew them. I told myself that it had to be a lucky guess or some kind of trick. End quote. This is the only explanation I can come up with, some kind of trick. Here's one more testimony. The last one I'll recount. There's so many in this book. It's just packed full of accounts like this. This is from a critical care physician and ICU director. Quote, Howard not only remembered the events of his cardiac arrest, what was said, what people were wearing, who was present, but he recounted it in such detail that it was clear he was a witness to his own event, even though he was completely unconscious at the time. So he saw what was going on, heard it, witnessed it, recounted it, and he was completely unconscious at the time. I could have rationalized some of his memories away by accepting that perhaps, while unconscious, he was able to hear on some level. Now, this is a valid point. Maybe unconscious people do hear things. Apparently they can. But Howard was not only telling me what he heard, but also what he had seen with incredible accuracy. So here's an unconscious man, during his cardiac arrest, who could see, quote, with incredible accuracy what was going on around him and above him and so on, with great lucidity. He said, and this is the patient, I felt myself rising up through the ceiling, and it was like I was going through the structure of the ceiling. He moved like a spirit or ghost or whatever you want to call it, through the building itself. There were individual rooms all around the edge, and on some of the beds were these people, except they were not really people exactly. They looked like mannequins, and they had IVs hooked up to them, but they didn't look real. In the center was an open area that looked like a collection of workstations with computers. That's when my jaw really dropped, says the physician. Right above the ICU is a nurse training center where new hires spend a few days rotating through different scenarios. There are simulated hospital rooms around the perimeter with medical mannequins, dummies, I guess, on some of the beds. In the center, there is indeed a collection of workspaces with computers. The doctor concluded, I was amazed, end quote. Now, those are the ends of the anecdotes. I'm not going to mention more. There are literally hundreds in this extraordinary book. First, I want to just mention some of Professor Dale Allison's conclusions, and then I'll come to my own more explicit conclusions. Dale Allison says on page 139, I acknowledge that these accounts are anecdotal, he writes. This does not, however, leave us free to discount them without compunction. There is often strength in numbers, and if the anecdotes come from on-the-scene experts, which they did, who admit to being flummoxed, does this not intimate a genuine anomaly, he writes. Those who believe, because of their worldview, that the testimonies just quoted cannot imply what they seem to imply are like the philosopher David Hume on miracles. He's a famous Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, very skeptical. The impossible is impossible, whatever the testimony to the contrary. That's what David Hume would say. The impossible is impossible, whatever the evidence to the contrary. Such people, says Dale Allison, are immovable objects. In other words, like a brick wall, you can't do anything with it. What, however, of the rest of us who are subject to persuasion? I think any reasonable person should be open to persuasion. How many perplexed testimonials from attending medical professionals do we need before the skeptical dissections begin to feel strained? I am unsure, but maybe we are already there. End quote. Yep, I agree. But we really need to know what's going on. I think we can be more explicit than Dale is. We've looked at the lucidity before death, and we've looked at people having near-death experiences. And I think in the light of all the evidence just narrated, and there's much, much more, we can reasonably conclude that our world, our universe, is much more multidimensional, strange, and spiritual than the philosophy of materialism would suggest. Materialism, of course, denies the supernatural, denies the transcendent, reduces everything to mere matter. It would appear that even well-established scientific views of our origins as a species are called into question by this data. Now, how so? How do I think they're called into question? Well, this is my view, and I'll end in a second with some quotes from the Qur'an. The purely materialist explanation of our origins as human beings needs to incorporate, I suggest, the empirically grounded observation that we have souls or spirits or whatever you want to call them that are the essence of what we are. That our minds, our consciousness are not merely the byproducts of our brains, as materialism would have us believe, that the core of what we are, ourselves, survives bodily death. That the religious explanation of where we came from, i.e. God, and where we are headed after this life, i.e. the afterlife, are true descriptions of reality after all. One day, I think, the ruling Western materialist outlook will need to undergo another paradigm shift if it is to encompass the extraordinary documented phenomena that are widely experienced. These experiences, by the way, are not rare. I won't go into the statistics, you can look in the book, but they are surprisingly common. So if we are to encompass these extraordinary documented phenomena that are widely experienced and researched, but are still not taken seriously by the gatekeepers of knowledge in our society. So what I'm going to do now is just quote a few verses from the Qur'an, which I think point in the same direction about the nature of us as human beings and our souls and what happens when we die. And in one passage in the Qur'an it says, "It is Allah who calls back the souls of people upon their death, as well as the souls of the living during their sleep. He then keeps those for whom he has ordained death and releases the others until their appointed time." And many people, by the way, with NDEs report that they had reached a certain limit in their experience when they were told, it's not your time. You can't go any further. You must go back. You must go back to this world. This is a very frequent testimony. The Quran says, "Surely in this are signs for people who reflect." So instead of the David Humes of this world dogmatically rejecting this phenomena, the Quran is inviting us to reflect. In another passage, my final one, the Quran says, "You paid no attention to this day, but today we have removed your veil and your sight is sharp." 50:22. You have paid no attention, almost as if speaking to mankind here, those who refuse to acknowledge this phenomena. You paid no attention to this day, the day of someone's death. But today we have removed your veil so people can see now, and your sight is sharp. They can see these realities, these other dimensions of existence that this phenomena alludes to quite powerfully, I think. And I mentioned the questioning of our origins as a species. I think if we now understand who we are as human beings now, as embodied people who possess spirits or souls that are not simply produced by the brain, but somehow are separated from the brain in very extreme situations like approaching death or near-death experiences. This suggests we cannot just be products of an undesigned, blind, material process of evolution. Human beings, I mean, specifically human beings. Because it cannot account, there's no way that physical, material evolution that's not directed alone can give rise to spiritual reality, to our consciousness, which will survive our bodily death. So we need a paradigm shift there, a different understanding of who we are as a species, in the light of all this phenomena that is increasingly available to look at and research and examine ourselves online. So I think this is an extraordinary challenge to materialism. Of course, it vindicates Islam and its beliefs. It also vindicates other faiths which assert the same thing, of course, that have a vivid belief in the afterlife and the existence of our souls or spirits beyond death. Inshallah, more and more of us will understand this and see the world differently and live accordingly, inshallah. Till next time.